All right. Let's do this. Lesson 15, World War II. Little bit of a refresher for you. Some of you, I'm going to ask if you remember any of this. Maybe this is the first time you've learned it. Obviously, the events and effects and devastation of World War I, along with the economic woes of the Great Depression, are going to lead to political and social unrest all over the world. This will pave the way for the rise of the World War II totalitarian dictators. Did anybody learn about these totalitarian dictators last year? Okay, see a couple of heads nodding. If not, here's how this is going to go. I am basically teaching them chronologically from the time they come to power. I think that's kind of the easiest way to do it. So, 1922, Benito Mussolini. At one time he was a teacher, then he was a soldier in World War I, and then he became a newspaper editor and owner. He, Il Duce, as he was known, rose to power under the guise of the fascist party. Fascist, he wants to return Italy back to the glory and power of the Roman Empire. He led a militant group known as the Black Shirts. They will march on Rome in October of 1922, and by decree of the King of Italy, Mussolini will become the leader of fascist Italy. He will also start some of the earliest aggression at the start of World War II, not before the start of World War II, rather, with the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 to boost Italian prestige. Questions about Mussolini? All right. 24, the rise of Stalin, the man of steel. Remember, Stalin had been a young leader in the Bolshevik Revolution, and he will not come to power until the leader of the Bolshevik movement and communist Russia, or the Soviet Union, dies, Vladimir Lenin. Stalin will rule with an iron fist. He is one of the most ruthless dictators in world history. He will institute the Great Purge from 1936 to 1938, killing somewhere between, the estimates are as high as 2 million civilians and military people that he believed to be enemies of the state, of the Soviet Union and communism. But many of these people were confined to prison camps in what area of the Soviet Union and in Russia? Very cold in this region. Siberia. Is that what you're going to say? You gotta just say it.
No, I didn't know.
It's all good. Do y'all know what those prisons were called? The gulags. Very good. Nice job. Well done. So the gulag system, pretty devastating. This is actually going to create big problems for the Soviets early in the war because a lot of those political enemies were highly trained military leaders who couldn't lead forces at the start of the war because they were either imprisoned or dead. Probably the most significant Soviet leader that goes into exile and will ultimately be hunted down in Mexico and killed in 1940. Do you guys remember I was talking about Leon Trotsky before? He was one of the leaders of the Bolshevik movement. Stalin maintained complete control over his people, government, and his country's economic system until his death in 1953, after World War II. 1933, Adolf Hitler, der Führer, becomes Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany. He removed the Weimar Republic, replaced it with the Nazi Party's Third Reich after the burning of the Reichstag, which they blamed a communist for, but it's probably the Nazis who set the fire. Promising a 1,000-year reign, he'll preach his beliefs that were laid out in his autobiography memoir, Mein Kampf, written in jail in the 1920s. Bless you. His initial military force or militia group were known as the Stormtroopers or the Brown Shirts, but many of these individuals were killed as a result of Hitler's purge, the Night of Long Knives. Notably, leader of the Brown Shirts, Ernst Röhm, who was instrumental in influencing Hitler to join the Nazi Party movement. Hitler's new secret police group, absolutely ruthless and horrific in terms of the Holocaust, the Waffen-SS and the Gestapo, they'll carry out much of the death and destruction of the Holocaust, those death squads. And he'll set out to follow through with the final solution, the extermination of all Jews and undesirables. And he also plans for world domination. 1939, Francisco Franco, Generalissimo, led a rebel nationalist army to victory in the Spanish Civil War. Franco started his aggression back in 1936, but was eventually backed by both Hitler and Mussolini. This is where the Nazis were able to test out their blitzkrieg, lightning strike, battle strategies. It also cemented the alliance between Hitler and Mussolini, the Rome-Berlin axis. Spain remains neutral, but Franco aligned himself with Hitler. And then in 1941, Hideki Tojo, who we talked about last lesson, who had been leader of the Kwantung Army, becomes Prime Minister of Japan and the Japanese military dictator, leaving Emperor Hirohito a powerless figurehead. Tojo supported Japanese domination beyond China, and he's also one of the masterminds behind Operation Z, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Questions about our dictators? Okay, so on the left we have Mussolini and Hitler. They're sort of center-left, Stalin, center-right, Franco, and to the right there we have Tojo. Questions? All right. The start of World War II. World War II begins. As I said before, much of the World War II causes were World War I leftovers. Global depression, rise of nationalism and militarism, anger from Versailles, resentment from Versailles and the League of Nations, as well as racism. World War II begins with Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, created through a false flag operation known as Operation Hummingbird. This is going to ultimately lead to, just a few weeks later, or shy of a few weeks later, the invasion of the Soviets from the East. 9 days prior to the invasion of the Germans and the Soviets brokered what was called the Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they promised that they would not go to war with each other, but they also would have an alliance. Obviously, they want Poland because Poland's a post-World War I self-determination situation. They want to split Poland in two. It's amazing what the Poles did with what they had. They had a very difficult time getting their tanks mobilized. Many of their planes never got off the ground. Some of their cavalry units were still on horseback. They managed to resist for a month or shy of it. At the end of September, the Poles will surrender at Warsaw, and Poland will be partitioned in two. Do keep in mind, guys, Hitler's aggression started all the way back in 1936 when he took the Rhineland and then Austria and Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, which were all violations of the Treaty of Versailles. But the Brits and the French allowed him to keep taking more and more and more. Do y'all know what we call that? Where they just allowed him to do more and more and more to try to prevent war. It's called appeasement. Okay? Well, they were passive for sure. What they will ultimately do with Hitler is sign the Munich Pact. That Munich Pact is what he broke when he invaded Poland, which is the reason that both Britain and France will declare war. The period between the late fall, early winter of 1939 and the late winter, early spring of 1940 is what is referred to in Europe as the Phony War. There's not a whole lot going on. The Germans were launching submarine attacks on British vessels in the Atlantic. That's called the Battle of the Atlantic. It lasted for the entirety of the war. If you're ever in New York City and you're down at the Battery, where you pick up the ferry to go see Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, there's a huge monument dedicated to the Americans who died in the Battle of the Atlantic. It's pretty amazing. We're going to talk more about it later. The Soviets did something very dumb, and that winter they decided to invade Finland. This is called the Winter War. Has anyone ever heard of this before? It cost tens of thousands of Soviet lives. They will ultimately sign an armistice to stop it once the Soviets broke through the fjords. But this will ultimately pull the Finns to the side of the Nazis when they invade the Soviets and break the non-aggression pact. There's also a really famous guy from the Winter War. Has anyone ever heard of Simo Häyhä before? He's called the White Death. He's the most decorated sniper in military history. It's pretty insane what he did in the Winter War. I mean, the Finns were fighting on skis and their gear were getting pulled by reindeer. Soviets came in there in green uniforms and were just getting picked off left and right. May 10, 1940, this is when everything changes. The Germans are going to invade and overrun Western Europe, overrunning France in the style of blitzkrieg warfare that they had used in Poland, with the use of panzers, Luftwaffe aircraft, and infantry. They invaded the Ardennes in Belgium, and they went past, after World War I, the French had built this amazing defensive line. Has anyone out there ever heard of the Maginot Line before? It's an unbelievable defensive fortress. If you get a chance, take a look at it. It's a weird bucket list item for me. I want to visit the Maginot Line at some point. Well, the French built this, and it bunched up over against the Ardennes. They didn't think that the Germans would be able to get through the Ardennes, but they did. So the Germans just go around, and then they ultimately occupy the Maginot Line. The Germans will overrun Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway, trapping British, French, Dutch soldiers at the port of Dunkirk. Has anyone ever heard of Operation Dynamo before? In May of 1940, anything that could float across the English Channel fishing boats, yachts, tugboats, anything went over to save 300,000 Allied soldiers. Highly recommended film. Has anyone out there ever seen the film Dunkirk before? Check it out. Won a number of awards. The Nazis maintained occupation of France until the summer of 1944. Hitler then sets his sights on Britain in the Battle of Britain from the late summer through the middle of fall 1940, from late July all the way to the end of October. The German Luftwaffe will attack London and other industrial cities in England by air. However, even though over 10,000 civilians and thousands of soldiers and airmen were killed as a result, the Brits will prevail in the Battle of Britain for a variety of reasons. Ultra, their code-breaking group, Radar, that Hermann Goering, leader of the Luftwaffe, wildly underestimated, and the resolve of the British people. We've all seen that propaganda, keep calm and carry on, right? That's part of the British mantra. That's when that piece of propaganda comes about. Hitler's ultimate goal following the Battle of Britain was to launch an amphibious invasion of England through what was called Operation Sea Lion, but it was never able to come to fruition. So Hitler changes gears, and he's going to make a very, very big mistake. In June of 1941, Hitler will break the Non-Aggression Pact and launch an invasion of the Soviet Union in what is known as Operation Barbarossa. They think they're going to take the Soviet Union very quickly. But not only is the Soviet Union very large, but what other advantage will the Soviets have as this fighting drags on? Winter. Stalin often referred to General Winter as one of his greatest assets. And the Germans are going to get pinned down and be way spread out. Roosevelt wins re-election in 40 in another landslide against Wendell Willkie, Republican candidate. This is Roosevelt's unprecedented third victory. Our first president in American history to be elected to 3 terms. He'll be elected ultimately to a 4th. He doesn't serve much of it, but he was elected to it. Roosevelt starts to move the country away from neutrality toward non-belligerency. America starts to mobilize for war. Does anybody have any questions about any parts of this? Start of World War II? Anything at all? Bless you. Nothing? Okay. So, on the top left, German Luftwaffe, they had some pretty devastating planes in their air arsenal. The Stuka bombers, the Heinkel 3 bombers, the Messerschmitt fighter planes. These were all just highly technical aeronautical fighting machines. Bottom left, Germans marching into Warsaw. Over here on the right, we see a map that shows the German invasion from the west and the Soviet invasion of Poland from the east. German invasion started on September 1st, 1939. Soviet invasion, September 17, 1939. Please stop me if you have questions. On the top left here, we have a Heinkel 3 being used in the Battle of Britain by the German Luftwaffe. Bottom left, this is a British scout on a rooftop trying to scout German planes. And on the right, we have a political cartoon of Hitler stabbing Stalin in the back. Forgive me, comrade, but it seems such a good opportunity. What are some resources that the Nazis want from the Soviet Union with this invasion? Help me out. I mean, their goal is to turn the Soviet Union into just a big colony with no civil rights. Basically, they're going to try to put the Russians back into serfdom. But what resources would they want? Anybody? Yeah. Oil from the Caucasus. Anyone else? Any wild guesses? Timber, coal, iron, wheat. The list goes on and on. Okay? The Soviets were rich in resources. All right. American aid and movement toward war. America started to slowly move away from isolationism because there was still a lot of strong isolationist sentiment at home. America is not too keen on inserting itself into this war until it is provoked. The United States, though, starts to help Britain. Why? Why would we want to help Britain? Same deal from World War I. What is Britain to us? What is Britain to us? They're an ally, right? Specifically in terms of what? Trade. Very good. Nice job. All right? So, Roosevelt administration is going to strike a couple of deals for the Brits to receive naval warships and material in return for military bases in Bermuda and the Caribbean. These two programs were called the Lend-Lease Act and the Destroyer Deal. And most of those destroyers were like Clemson-class destroyers from World War I. Pretty much obsolete, but still, Britain was happy to have them. FDR will appoint General George C. Marshall, VOI class of 1901, as the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and America institutes a peacetime draft in 1940. Marshall will begin to mobilize the country for war. All right? This is a very important appointment for FDR. We'll talk more about Marshall as we move forward. America starts to train soldiers and sailors for combat. Lots of supply through Lend-Lease get passed to the British, the Soviets, and China in 1941. This is a very famous cartoon by a very famous cartoonist. Who's the cartoonist? It's Dr. Seuss. It says U.S. Lend-Lease and Dunking Company. See ya. It's truly encouraging how much of this stuff drifts into British ports because much of the Lend-Lease war material was going to Britain. Franklin Roosevelt compared Lend-Lease to lending a neighbor a garden hose if their house was on fire. The opposition, led by Gerald Nye, leader of the Nye Committee, who was an isolationist, said, Lend-Lease is like letting your neighbor borrow a piece of bubble gum. You're not going to want it back after it's been chewed up. There's also what is called the America First movement, which was pretty anti-Semitic. Its two leaders, or at least its spokesman, was Charles Lindbergh, and one of its leading financiers was Henry Ford. They're going to really push to keep America out of this war until what event? Pearl Harbor. Then they've got to step in line and be a part of the war effort, which they will. So Japanese and U.S. entry into World War II. Any questions up to this point? Everybody good? All right. Remember, this is old news. We talked about it last lesson during the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. During the 1930s, militaristic Japan, Hideki Tojo and the Kuomintang Army invaded and brutalized Manchurian China, and it sought both military and economic dominance over Asia. The invasion was absolutely brutal and horrific. It was an attempted genocide. I talked about the go-to book on the topic, The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. It's a pretty brutal book. The U.S. refused to recognize Japanese gains in the region. A big part of this is because the Roosevelt administration supported the Chiang Kai-shek regime. And there were also some really powerful Chinese power brokers in America, the Soong family in particular, that wanted America to step in. So the way that America stepped in was to impose an embargo on oil, petroleum, and steel to Japan. Tensions will rise, and they will get to an even greater height with the Panay incident in China. This is where the Japanese sunk an American Navy gunboat in China that cost the lives of several Americans. While negotiating, Japanese diplomats and Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington, D.C. will learn of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Operation Z, in total secrecy, even though there are members of the Navy Department, the intelligence that were talking about rumblings of an attack on Pearl Harbor. The White House was unaware. There were even Japanese diplomats that were unaware. This was a carrier-based attack that went in two ways. One group of planes are going to hit the harbor. Another group of planes are going to hit Wheeler Airfield. What this will do is cause total chaos and destruction. And the U.S. was very lucky that 3 of our carriers were on an exercise that morning. They're on a training exercise. Had they been at Pearl Harbor, it would have been far, far worse for us as a country to try to mobilize and rapidly build 3 new aircraft carriers from scratch. The attack came on Sunday morning. The people of Hawaii provided a perfect beacon. There was a radio station that was on that morning that led the Japanese to be able to attack in radio silence. Why Sunday morning? Yeah, total element of surprise. People are at church. Most of your sailors and soldiers are off. Some of them might even be sleeping off a good time from the night before. Nobody's ready for this, all right? So the attack will destroy much of the American Pacific Fleet, with the exception of our 3 carriers. Over 2,400 civilians and military personnel were killed. 21 U.S. naval ships were destroyed or damaged, including 8 battleships, and over 300 aircraft were taken out. The USS Arizona, sunk on December 7, 1941, is to this day the Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii. FDR will call this attack a date that will live in infamy. Next day, December 8, we declare war on Japan. A few days later, December 11th, 1941, Germany declares war on the U.S. I always find it interesting. My grandfather's birthday was on the 10th, and right when Pearl Harbor was attacked, he rushed. He ate a bunch of bananas and stuffed a bunch of rocks in his pocket so it would make weight, because he was so rail skinny from the Depression, and rushed to go enlist in the Army. And he ends up becoming an artilleryman. We'll talk more about him later. All right. So this is the area that Japan has control of on the top left, invasion of Manchuria. Two pieces of propaganda here: avenge December 7th, remember December 7th. And then this is an image from the attack. And then over here on the left is a painting from the attack. Comments, questions, concerns? All right. So the U.S. and Japan clash in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler will declare war on the U.S. Very quickly, within days and weeks, Japan keeps the hostility going. They took Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, also Hong Kong and Singapore. As we already know, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines are U.S. territories. Who has control of Hong Kong and Singapore? No. Britain, very good. Excellent job. At its height in World War II, Japan controlled 10% of the globe. U.S. forces were taken prisoner, forced out of the Philippines, Guam, and Wake. Upon leaving the Philippines for Australia, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Army forces in the Pacific, famously said, "I shall return." Roosevelt wanted him to say, "We shall return," and he was like, "I shall return." He and Roosevelt didn't really like each other much. The guy that's left to command the remaining forces after the fall of Corregidor, General Jonathan Wainwright, and in April of 1942, 75,000 American and Philippine soldiers were captured and marched on the 100-mile Bataan Death March. Horrifically brutal, violated the Geneva Convention. If these people fell out of line, they were decapitated with swords. They were buried alive. They were shot. It was horrible. Those that survived the Bataan Death March in the war, they were built different. They had a different level of resolve. Both Navy and Marine Corps units deployed to the Pacific. Husband E. Kimmel, admiral during Pearl Harbor, became the scapegoat of the attack. He will be replaced with U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz will remain in command of the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. Debates about isolationism were now over. World War II now truly became a global war. Highly recommended book, The Story of World War II by Donald Miller. Well worth your time. This is a book that I believe every American should have on their shelf. I'm just saying. And I've recommended a lot of books to you guys. Rarely do I physically have the book in my hand. This is an important one. Well worth your time. All right. You think I'm, hired? I was hired by Donald Miller, but I'm not. All right. So if we look at the map here in Europe, we've already talked about some of this. What we haven't talked about, or what I'm going to show you on the map that we didn't get to today, we'll get into next class. So we talked about the invasion of Poland. We talked about the invasion of Western Europe and France. We talked about the Battle of Britain. The direction we're heading in. We're going to talk about North Africa. Look, check it out, guys. El Alamein, right there. See? We're going to talk Italy. We're going to talk Normandy, D-Day, Battle of the Bulge. We're going to talk Stalingrad, Moscow, Leningrad, Kursk. We talk about a lot. And then ultimately the fall of Berlin. And it's wild. I'm only scratching the surface. Then In the Pacific, same deal. We talked about Pearl Harbor today, but what we're also going to learn about is Midway, Guadalcanal, Coral Sea, Palau, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Philippines, and of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so Allied strategies during World War II. Wartime strategies in World War II reflected the political and military goals of alliances, resources on hand, and the geographical extent of the conflict. America and its allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, after being invaded by Germany, followed a defeat Hitler first strategy. The first of these meetings, Roosevelt and Churchill met in Newfoundland in the Atlantic Conference. They'll later meet with Stalin in Tehran. We see them meeting here at Yalta. That's toward the end of the war. Most American military resources were targeted for Western Europe and the North African campaign. In the Pacific, American military strategy called for an island hopping campaign, seizing islands closer and closer to Japan and using them as basis for air attacks on Japan. This will be like a joint operation among Marine Corps, Navy, and later Army and the Air Corps. But do keep in mind, the Air Corps is not yet the Air Force. It's just the Army Air Corps, and then there's the Navy Air Corps. They want to cut off Japanese supplies through submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. I want you all to also understand U.S. aircraft carriers play a tremendously important role in this war. All right? Okay. This is where we're going to pump the brakes today. Axis strategies during World War II. Nazi Germany hoped to force Britain out of the war through the bombing campaign known as the Battle of Britain, and to defeat the Soviet Union quickly in Operation Barbarossa to gain control of Soviet resources. Neither strategy worked for Hitler. Nazi Germany submarine warfare against England and Allied shipping in the Battle of the Atlantic that lasted for the entirety of the war, but as more American industrial and military strength came about, that will help turn the tide of the war. Nazi Germany and its military was strung out on 3 separate fronts, all over Europe and in North Africa. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan invaded Pacific Islands, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Japanese leaders, though, hoped America would accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific rather than conducting a costly war to reverse Japanese gains. That will not be the case. We are going to inflict a very deadly campaign in the Pacific. Very good quote in relation to this, Admiral Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. That will most certainly be the case. That is all I've got for today. Do you guys have any questions for me? All right, cool.